Assalamu alaikum. Hope you guys are all fine. Today I am back with a great lecture by Dr. Naghman Zuberi, and today's topic is on the developmental defects and development of face. So I would first like to invite Dr. Naghman Zuberi. Assalamu alaikum, sir. How are you?
Walaikum Assalam. I am good, Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Sir, I am also fine. Sir,
Alhamdulillah.
you can start the lecture.
Okay, thank you. Today we will be discussing about the development of human face and certain developmental defects. So actually we will be focusing at the moment only on the cleft lip and cleft palate when we talk about the developmental defects. So first of all, keep in mind that when the human face it starts developing, so there are actually 5 prominences: the frontal nasal prominence, then the 2 paired maxillary prominences, and 2 mandibular paired prominences. They all are surrounding the future oral cavity, which we call stomodium. The facial primordia, it appears early in the 4th week around the stomodium, or which we call the primitive oral cavity, just like this. So as I told you that there is a frontonasal prominence, then 2 paired maxillary prominences, and there are 2 paired mandibular prominences. They are on the pericardial bulging. I have already mentioned about the 5 facial prominences around the stomodium, the single frontonasal prominence, and 2 paired maxillary prominences, and 2 paired mandibular prominences around the stomodium. The paired facial prominences are derivatives of the first pair of the pharyngeal arches. These prominences are produced mainly by the proliferation, or like when the neural crest cells they proliferate, so these prominences are produced. These cells migrate from the mesencephalon and the rhombencephalon regions of the neural folds into the arches during the 4th week. Before proceeding further, let's see the pharyngeal arches and their derivatives so that things will be much more clear to us. First pharyngeal arch, it is also known as maxillary mandibular pharyngeal arch, and its nerve is trigeminal nerve, or the 5th cranial nerve. The artery is maxillary artery and its terminal branches. So it is coming from the neural crest, and what it is going to make, it is going to make the mandible, maxilla, malleus, and incus, and the muscles of mastications, mylohyoid, tensor tympanic, as well as anterior belly of the digastricus muscle. The ligaments, anterior ligament of malleus and the sphenomandibular ligament, not the stylo, only sphenomandibular ligament. Some of the authors, they say that sphenomandibular ligament basically is the remnant of the Meckel's cartilage. Meckel's cartilage is that cartilage around which the mandible forms or mandible develops. Then the second pharyngeal arch is known as the hyoid pharyngeal arch, and its nerve is facial nerve, or the 7th cranial nerve. Its artery is stapedial when it is in the embryonic phase, and the adult phase is corticotympanic artery. The skeletal structures which are derived from the second pharyngeal arch are stapes, styloid process, lesser cornu of hyoid bone, upper part of the body of the hyoid bone. Muscles of facial expression, stapedius, stylohyoid, posterior belly of digastricus muscle, they are derived from the second hyoid muscle. So keep in mind that Digastric muscle, its anterior belly origin is from the first pharyngeal arch, and its posterior belly, it is derived from the second pharyngeal arch, as well as the stylohyoid ligament is also derived from the second pharyngeal arch. Then comes the third pharyngeal arch, that is the glossopharyngeal arch, or you can say that like the nerve is glossopharyngeal, and that is the ninth cranial nerve. Artery is common carotid artery as well as the internal carotid arteries. The skeletal structures, greater cornu of hyoid, lower part of the body of hyoid bone, and muscles stylopharyngeus. Then comes the fourth one, vagus and superior laryngeal branch. These are the nerves. The artery is part of aortic arch on the left side and part of the right subclavian artery on the right side. There is a difference in the left side and the right side. Skeletal structures which are derived from it: thyroid, cricoid, then arytenoid, corinculate, and cuneiform cartilages. Muscles: cricothyroid, soft palate, levator veli palatini, but not the tensor veli palatini. Then comes the sixth one. Fifth, either it is not present or it disappears very quickly. So vagus, the 10th nerve, and the recurrent laryngeal branches, these are the nerves from pharyngeal arch. Artery, part of the left pulmonary artery on the left side and part of the right pulmonary artery on the right side. Skeletal structures which are derived from the sixth arch: thyroid, cricoid, arytenoid, corinculate, and cuneiform cartilages. And the intrinsic muscles of larynx, but cricothyroid muscle is not from the sixth arch. Neural crest derivatives, the cranial neural crest derived mesenchymal cells, ectomesenchyme, migrate into the pharyngeal arches from midbrain and hindbrain region. They form neurons, Schwann cells, smooth muscle cells, osteoblasts, chondrocytes, as well as odontoblasts. Pharyngeal arches and derivatives, as we have discussed, just for your revision, and if you will be looking at this slide again and again, so it will help you if you will be appearing in any exam or just to remember these things. Pharyngeal arch one, also known as mandibular arch, it has two prominences: the smaller, which is upper, maxillary, we call it maxillary, it forms maxilla, zygomatic bone, and the squamous part of the temporal bone. Larger, the lower one, it is known as mandibular prominence, and it forms mandible. The pharyngeal arch 2, hyoid arch, it forms most of the hyoid bone. Arches 3 and 4, they form neck structure, and 6, thyroid and cricoid cartilages and intrinsic muscles of the larynx. Now, again, back to our topic. As I told you about the frontonasal prominence and then the two maxillary prominences and the two mandibular prominences. Now, two nasal placoids, they also start arising, and these are basically the future nasal cavities. Two bilateral oval thickenings in the surface ectoderm of the frontonasal prominence appear by the end of the 4th week. Nasal placoids are the primordia of the nose and the nasal cavities. Initially, these placoids, they are slightly protruded or convex. They are protruded outside. But as the time passes, then they start getting depressed or they start becoming concave. Well, these are the primitive nasal cavities or the nasal placoids. This is how the fetus will start looking once the nasal placoids, they will be started appearing, and you can see these prominences over here around it, the medial nasal prominence and the lateral nasal prominence, and these are separated by a groove over here. So more or less the picture will be like this if we talk about the schematic diagram. As the time passes, the cells in the prominences, they start proliferating, and these nasal placodes, they become the actual cavities, which will be in future, they will be nasal cavities or the nares. Mesenchyme in the margins of the placodes proliferate, producing horseshoe-shaped elevations, which we call medial and lateral nasal prominences. I have already mentioned about those, the medial and the nasal prominences. Mesial and lateral nasal prominences. This is the nasal pit. Now the placodes, they are being called as the nasal pit. Now the pits, these are the primordia of the anterior nares or nostrils and the nasal cavities. I have already mentioned about that. Now, the mesenchymal cells are the major source of the connective tissue components, including muscles, cartilage, bone, and ligaments in the facial and in the oral regions. The frontonasal prominence is formed out of two parts. The frontal part forms the forehead, and the nasal part, it forms the rostral boundary of the stomodium. Rostral, if we talk about the rostral and caudal, just to give you like a revision, rostral is always from the top and caudal is from the bottom. So that's how rostral and caudal are. The paired maxillary prominences form the lateral boundaries of the stomodium. The paired mandibular prominences constitute the caudal boundary of the primitive mouth. Facial development occurs mainly between the 4th and the 8th weeks. Some of the authors, they say that it prolongs up to the 9th week. By the end of the embryonic period, that is the 8th week, the face has an unquestionable human appearance. And this is the time when most of the face, it is having the same appearance as it is going to be a human face. There is no difference. Like definitely there will be some development and postnatal growth and all those, they will contribute, but you can say the blueprint is there. Between the 7th and 8th weeks, the two medial nasal prominences merge with each other and with the maxillary and lateral nasal prominences. Merging of the medial nasal and maxillary prominences result in continuity of the upper jaw and the upper lip, and separation of the nasal pits from the stomodium, maxillary and the medial nasal prominences. When they are going to merge, as well as both the medial nasal prominences, they will merge, they will make the upper lip and the anterior portion of the upper jaw. The lower jaw and the lower lips are the first parts of the face to form. So keep in mind that firstly, the mandibular prominences, they merge and they make the lower jaw and the lower lip. Then later the upper lip and upper anterior jaw, it is going to form. They result from merging of the medial ends of the mandibular prominences in the median plane. I have already mentioned that. The mandibular prominences, they are the first to merge. Well, at times, if they are not merging and there is a problem, there would be a chance of cleft in the mandibular region as well. But it is a very, very rare condition. To be very honest, in my clinical experience, I haven't seen even a single case with mandibular cleft. It does not mean that they don't exist. Books, they say that definitely there were some cases reported of the median cleft of the lower lip as well. So the mandibular prominences, they merge and they form the lower lip and the lower jaw. This is how the median cleft lower lip may appear. Each lateral nasal prominence is separated from the maxillary prominence by a cleft called nasolacrimal groove. As I told you earlier, the medial prominences, they merge with the maxillary prominences. Lateral prominences, they do not. They are separated from the maxillary prominence because of nasolacrimal groove. Here, this is the nasolacrimal groove. The nasolacrimal groove. Lateral prominences, they don't contribute to the upper lip. Development of the palate. As the medial nasal prominences, they merge, they form an intermaxillary segment. The intermaxillary segment gives rise to the philtrum, the premaxillary part of the maxilla and associated gingivae, as well as the primary palate. This area, also called premaxilla. This area is also known as premaxilla, canine to canine area. This is the philtrum area. So 4 maxillary incisors, they are coming from the part which is formed by the fusion of the median nasal prominences as well as the maxillary prominences. Development of the palate, it starts like the development of the palate, it occurs in 2 stages. Firstly, the primary palate, which I have already mentioned, and then the development of the secondary palate. Palatogenesis begins at the end of the 5th week and is completed at 12th week. Critical time is between 6 to 9 weeks. This is the time when clefting of the palate may occur. Primary palate, as we have already mentioned, early in the 6th week, the primary palate or median palatine process begins to develop from the intermaxillary segment of the maxilla. We have already discussed that. Initially, this segment is formed by merging of the medial nasal prominences, and later the 2 maxillary prominences, they also join. The primary palate forms the premaxillary part of the maxilla. It represents only a small part of the adult hard palate, only the premaxillary area. 2 medial nasal prominences, when they join, intermaxillary segment is formed and it gives rise to the primary palate. Here again, this picture will tell you a lot about it. The nasal pit, this is the lateral nasal prominence, this is the medial nasal prominence, this is the maxillary prominence, and here the lateral prominences, they are separated by the nasolacrimal groove. You can see about it. The medial nasal prominences, when they combine, they join, they give rise to the anterior maxillary segment, or you can say the premaxillary area. They merge. So primary palate is formed. Secondary palate. Secondary palate starts appearing after that. It is the primordium of the hard and soft palate. It begins to develop early in the 6th week from 2 mesenchymal projections that extend from the internal aspects of the maxillary prominences like this. Firstly, they will go inferiorly and medially. Then the tongue is for, like when the development starts, the tongue is somewhere lying over in this area. Tongue descends. If tongue is not going to descend, then there will be definitely chances of clefting. So once the tongue is going to descend, it will provide kind of support or scaffolding to these projections, which we call the palatal shelf. And these palatal shelves, they start moving towards each other, then they fuse. If tongue is not descending, they will just move inferiorly and medially. So initially, the lateral palatine processes of the palatal shelves project medially on each side of the developing tongue. Just let me, I will enlarge it for you. Here you can see just the side view. This is the lateral palatal process. This is the nasal septum. As these prominences, they start moving towards inferiorly and medially, the tongue descends. And then they start fusing. Not only they are fusing together, they are also fusing with the premaxillary area, with the primary palate. Tongue is just providing a support over here. It is also going to fuse with the nasal septum. And finally, we will be having the hard palate as well as the soft palate. This is the lateral palatine process. You can see the fusion has occurred and we have developed palate. This is the uvula area. This is the soft palate. This is the hard palate. And here the fusion with the primary palate has occurred. As the jaws develop, the tongue becomes relatively smaller and moves inferiorly. I have already told you about that. During the 7th and 8th weeks, the lateral palatine processes elongate and ascend to a horizontal position superior to the tongue. Gradually, these processes, they approach each other as well as they fuse in the median plane and they fuse with the nasal septum as well. The palatine processes also fuse with the nasal septum and the posterior part of the primary palate. The nasal septum develops as a downgrowth from the internal parts of the merged medial nasal prominences. The fusion between the nasal septum and the palatine processes begins anteriorly during the 9th week and is completed posteriorly by the 12th week. You can see how they merge and how they are moving towards each other. So not only they are fusing with each other, they are also going to merge with the nasal septum as well. Bone gradually develops in the primary palate, forming the premaxillary part of the maxilla, which lodges the incisor teeth. We have already discussed about it. Concurrently, bone extends from the maxillae and palatine bones into the lateral palatine process to form the hard palate. The posterior part of these processes, they do not get ossified. That is the soft palate. They extend posteriorly beyond the nasal septum and fuse to form the soft palate. I have already mentioned about the soft palate. Its soft conical projection is called uvula. At times, it does not fuse, and you can see a bifid uvula as well. The median palatine raphe indicates the line of fusion of the lateral palatine processes. This is how an adult's palate without any defect, if you are going to remove the mucosa and the periosteum, it will appear something like this. These two bones are known as the palatine bones. Cleft lip and palate, why they occur? The defect is usually classified according to the developmental criteria. There are two major groups of cleft lip and cleft palate. Clefts involving the upper lip and the anterior part of the maxilla, and clefts involving the hard and soft regions of the palate. So over here you can see it could be unilateral, it could be just the cleft uvula, it could be bilateral, it could be unilateral with the cleft of lip, or bilateral cleft of palate as well as only the anterior segment, as well as clefting of the lip. It could be a serious condition like this where there will be bilateral hair lip or bilateral cleft lip, clefting of the primary palate, as well as unilateral clefting of the hard palate or the secondary palate. Or it could be a through and through bilateral clefting. At times, oblique facial clefts may occur. Different types of clefts: bilateral hair lip, median hair lip, microstomia, unilateral macrostomia, microstomia, macrostomia. All these, they may occur. Bifiduvula, as I told you, unilateral hair lip with incomplete cleft palate, and the bilateral hard hair lip with bilateral incomplete cleft palate, or a through and through unilateral. It could be through and through bilateral as well, as I have already mentioned. Here you can see a picture of a child with unilateral hair lip and clefting in the primary palate. Here is a picture of a child with bilateral clefting of the lip as well as clefting of the primary palate. In this case, you can see a through and through unilateral clefting, including the hair lip as well as the primary palate and the secondary palate. Well, at times what occurs, there is no clefting of the lip, the primary palate is intact, but there is clefting of the hard palate only, or secondary palate only. Now we are going for a quick review. What happens? This is the nasolacrimal groove, the medial nasal process, and the lateral nasal process, and the maxillary prominence. We have already discussed it is the medial nasal prominence which actually merge with the maxillary prominences and on bilaterally, and they also merge with each other to give the continuity of the upper lip and the upper jaw. So what is going to happen if all of these, they are not going to merge? There will be a huge cleft, which is oblique facial cleft. Oblique facial cleft. During the 7th week, the two medial nasal processes, they fuse to form the intermaxillary segment. Lateral nasal prominence and the maxillary prominence, if they are not going to fuse, there will be median cleft lip. Median cleft lip if they are not going to fuse. The intermaxillary segment and the maxillary prominences fuse, forming the upper lip and jaw architecture. Lateral nasal prominence and the maxillary prominence. What if they are not going to fuse? There will be cleft lip. Ten-week embryo. By week 10, the facial features resemble that of a neonate. The intermaxillary processes form the philtrum of the upper lip. At this point, and the maxillary prominences are starting to form the well-defined cheeks and portions of the upper jaw. This one in purple. So over here, we are done with our today's lecture, and we can also, if you want, we can go for some brief review on embryology related to head and neck, like in future, or we can, the next week, depends what you want, we can go for some lecture on the etiology of malocclusion. So it's your choice what you want. You want some quick review on embryology, it would be 1-hour lecture, or you want etiology of the malocclusion. So whatever you want, just let Farooq know and he will communicate with me. I'm open with any of these two topics for the next week and we can do it.
Thank you, sir. Sure, sir. It was a very great lecture. Thanks for giving a great lecture. Thanks a lot, sir. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.